New York had learned to worship its gods. They wore capes stitched by marketing departments and smiled through teeth polished for prime time. And the city, ever hungry for something to believe in, had long since stopped asking whether those smiles reached their eyes. Above the skyline, on a rooftop draped in the reflected gold of a Vought billboard, Homelander stood with his arms folded and his gaze fixed on the horizon. He listened to the murmur of the city the way a shepherd listens to sheep, half attentive, half bored, entirely certain of his place above them. Cameras below turned toward him whenever he moved. Applause was no longer a response. It was a reflex. Vought International had never known a quarter like this one. Stock prices climbed with the arrogance of a rising empire, and every network broadcast carried some carefully staged reminder of Homelander's benevolence. He rescued a school bus. He blessed a hospital. He waved at a parade. In boardrooms lined with mahogany and quiet threats, executives spoke of him the way ancient priests spoke of thunder. And behind every reverent word lay the same unspoken understanding. No force on earth could challenge him, not politicians, not armies, not truth. They were correct about the earth. They had not considered what might arrive from somewhere else, far beyond the reach of Vaught's satellites, in a laboratory that no longer existed on any map. A scientist named Bruce Banner had spent 17 sleepless hours trying to convince a machine not to kill him. The prototype dimensional reactor hummed with a sound that was almost prayerful, and the gamma cradle at its heart pulsed a soft, sickly green that reminded him of every mistake he had ever made. He had promised himself this would be different. He whispered that promise again as the readings climbed, as the walls began to tremble, as the light behind the glass rose to a color no human eye was ever meant to hold. Then the cosmic anomaly touched the reactor, and reality bent inward like a page catching flame. The explosion did not kill him. It unmade the distance between worlds. Above Manhattan, the sky tore open with the sound of a cathedral collapsing. A rift the color of poisoned emerald yawned wide over the financial district, and from within it fell a shape too vast to belong to any human nightmare. He struck the earth like a meteor given muscle. Concrete shattered outward in a ring of dust that swallowed 3 city blocks. Glass rained from 100 towers, and every alarm within a mile screamed at once. When the dust began to clear, something enormous was rising from the crater. Green shoulders, green fists. A breath that sounded like the beginning of a storm. Hulk opened his eyes on a world he did not recognize, and the world did not recognize him. Emergency broadcasts declared a terrorist attack within minutes. Satellites reported radiation signatures unlike anything on file, and analysts at Vought Tower stared at their monitors with the pale expressions of men watching their own obituaries scroll past. Somewhere in a sub-level laboratory, a scientist muttered that Compound V could not account for these numbers. Somewhere else, a director quietly ordered every recording of the sky to be seized. The military arrived before questions could be asked. Tanks rolled into the ruined avenues, helicopters carved circles overhead, and armored teams poured from black transports with weapons that had never before been aimed at something so patient. They fired anyway. Missiles bloomed against the giant's chest and left nothing but heat. Bullets sang across his skin and fell useless to the ground. Each explosion seemed to feed him, each impact to swell the fury in his shoulders, and the more they attacked, the more certain it became that they were teaching a god how angry he was allowed to be. Yet in the middle of that terrible response, something quieter was happening, and only one man noticed it. In a cramped apartment above a shuttered laundromat, Billy Butcher leaned toward his television with a beer forgotten in his hand. He watched the giant hurl a tank aside and step over a fleeing car without touching it. He watched him tear the wing from a helicopter and set the pilot down on a rooftop before turning back to the artillery line. He watched him swing at soldiers who had shot him and ignore the civilians who had not. Butcher's jaw tightened, not with fear but with something older and harder to name. He had spent his life learning the shape of monsters. This one did not fit. In the executive suites of Vought Tower, Panic wore expensive suits. This was not a soup. This was not anything they had built or bought or blackmailed into existence. His physiology defied their models. His energy signature made their instruments weep, and worst of all, the cameras of the world were pointing at him instead of them. On the rooftop of that same tower, Homelander watched the news with a smile that slowly forgot how to be a smile. He listened to anchors stumble over the phrase Green Titan. He heard crowds in the street, real crowds, chanting a name that was not his. He saw social media bloom with theories and hymns for a stranger. Jealousy is a small emotion in most men. In him it was a tectonic thing, patient and grinding, and it began its quiet work beneath his perfect face. He rose without a word. The wind of his ascent shattered the glass beside him, and no one on the ground below dared to look up. He flew toward the pillar of dust and green light, rising over lower Manhattan with the certainty of a man about to remind the world who its favorite was. He arrived just as the giant, breathing heavily amid a ring of burning steel, slowly turned his head. Their eyes met across the ruined avenue, and for the first time in his life, Homelander understood that he had been seen. Homelander struck first, because he had never known how to do anything else. He crossed the distance between them faster than sound, a red and white streak against the ruined skyline, and his fist connected with the giant's jaw in a blow that should have ended empires. The shockwave alone flattened a bus. Windows 6 blocks away shattered inward. For a heartbeat, the world held its breath, waiting for the familiar sight of an enemy folding beneath his hand. The giant's head turned with the punch, then slowly turned back. Hulk looked at him the way a mountain might look at a bird. Homelander laughed, though the laugh was thinner than he intended. He rose into the air and unleashed his heat vision in twin red beams that could carve through tank armor like paper. They struck the giant square in the chest and burned there, glowing bright, painting his green skin in furious light. Steam hissed from the impact. Yet when the beams faded, the skin beneath was unbroken, only angrier. Hulk answered. He caught a wrecked delivery truck by its axle and hurled it upward with the casual disgust of a man swatting an insect. Homelander shattered the vehicle mid-air with a swing of his forearm, but the debris rained around him like the pieces of some collapsed cathedral, and while he was distracted, the giant leapt. The leap alone cracked the pavement in a crater 10 meters wide. Homelander turned in time to catch two green hands closing around his shoulders, and the sky itself seemed to tilt as he was driven downward through the roof of a skyscraper, through floor after floor, through boardrooms and server farms and empty offices, until they burst out the far side in a cloud of glass and paper. They fought through the bones of the city. Homelander struck faster. Hulk struck harder. Every attempt to dominate the giant fed him. Every scream of pride only deepened the green fury in his eyes. Homelander punched and burned and roared, but the giant did not fall. Worse, the giant did not pursue him. Hulk fought only to be left alone, and that quiet fact was more insulting than any wound. News helicopters circled above like carrion birds, and for the first time in the modern era, the cameras of the world captured Homelander being physically overpowered. His cape tore, his nose bled. His perfect hair, that gilded halo of American mythology, hung in wet strands across his forehead. When Hulk finally threw him through the side of a parking garage and turned away, the golden god of Vought lay in a pile of concrete dust, chest rising too quickly, eyes wide with something he had never before been forced to feel. He was not sure what to call it. He would call it many things later, in the privacy of his tower. Fear was not yet in his vocabulary. The footage never aired. Within an hour, Vaught's crisis division had seized every recording, threatened every network, and drafted a triumphant press release describing how Homelander had heroically contained the unknown threat. Behind closed doors, the executives were less composed. They gathered around a long glass table where a single vial of blood, still faintly glowing, sat under armored glass. One of them whispered the word priceless. Another whispered opportunity. Somewhere between those two words, the decision was made that the giant would not be killed. He would be harvested. Imagine, someone murmured, a compound V distilled from that. Imagine a Homelander that could actually die when they told him to. Beneath the city, in the black arteries of an abandoned subway tunnel, Bruce Banner returned to himself. He came back the way he always did, Folded around his own ribs, shivering, half-naked, tasting iron and rain, the tunnel dripped around him. Distant sirens threaded through the walls. He pressed his palms against the cold concrete and tried to remember how to breathe like a man again. A cracked television lay in the debris nearby, still glowing. He crawled toward it because that was easier than standing. What he saw on the screen changed the shape of his fear. He saw a smiling man in a red cape lifting a plane full of passengers to safety, filmed from 12 flattering angles. He saw the same smiling man selling breakfast cereal. He saw a woman in electric blue endorsing a political candidate. He saw a masked figure signing autographs at a movie premiere. He saw the word Vought stamped over every act of heroism as if kindness itself had been trademarked. Bruce had known monsters. He had known aliens, gods, warlords, tyrants. He had never known this. In his world, the mighty at least pretended to serve. Here, service was the pretense. Compassion was marketing. Heroism was a product line. He sat back against the tunnel wall and felt something colder than gamma radiation move through him. He had crossed into a place where his sickness was celebrated and his conscience was obsolete. Then footsteps. Butcher came down the tunnel with the unhurried step of a man who had already decided how the conversation would end. Behind him moved Mother's Milk, patient and enormous, and Frenchie with his careful eyes, and Kimiko silent as breath. They did not raise their weapons. They did not need to. Butcher crouched a few meters away, studied the trembling scientist, and offered a small, crooked smile. "I don't know what you are, mate," he said, "but you scared the wrong people today. That makes you useful." Bruce looked at them for a long moment. He did not ask who they were. He already understood. They were what remained when a world of manufactured heroes finally birthed real ones by accident. "I have one condition," he said. His voice was steadier than his hands. "If he gets loose, if he starts hurting people who don't deserve it, you stop him. You promise me you'll stop him." Butcher's smile faded into something almost like respect. "Deal." None of them noticed the shape on the ceiling above. None of them heard the breath that did not breathe. Black Noir hung in the shadows, silent as an unspoken threat, and watched the fractured soul of a scientist accept the protection of monsters. The hunt had already begun. The safe house was a gutted print factory on the edge of the harbor, its windows painted black, its floor stained with decades of ink and older, darker things. The boys had used it before. Butcher liked it because it had 3 exits and no neighbors. Bruce liked it because it was quiet enough to hear himself think, and thinking at that moment was the only weapon he had left. He sat on an overturned crate with a wool blanket around his shoulders and a mug of something that pretended to be coffee cooling between his hands. Frenchie moved around him with the delicate patience of a man defusing a bomb, cleaning the small cuts along Bruce's arms, cataloging the strange patterns in his blood, murmuring in a mixture of French and admiration. Mother's Milk stood by the door with his arms folded and his eyes on the street. Butcher watched the scientist the way one watches a fire that has not yet decided which direction to burn. Bruce spoke first, because silence had begun to hurt. He told them about the gamma, about the accident that had made him, about the years of running, the years of trying, the years of failure. He did not tell them the worst parts. He never did. But he told them enough for Frenchie to lower his instruments in quiet reverence, and enough for Butcher's grin to fade into something more thoughtful than triumph. "You didn't hurt them," Butcher said at last. "In the city, you had every chance. You didn't." Bruce closed his eyes. "He hurts what hurts him," he answered. "Sometimes that is the same as innocence. Sometimes it isn't. I have spent my life trying to know the difference." Butcher nodded slowly. In another world, he might have said something kind. In this one, he simply refilled the man's mug. The attack came without warning because Black Noir did not believe in warnings. The first sign was the absence of Mother's Milk, whose steady presence at the door vanished between one breath and the next. There was no cry, no struggle. Only the soft, dull impact of a body meeting concrete, and then the sound of nothing at all. Butcher was already moving, gun in hand, curse on his lips, when the lights above them shattered in a single coordinated hiss. Darkness swallowed the factory. Noir did not fight the way men fought. He fought the way disease spread, the way rot climbed through a wall. He struck at Frenchie first because Frenchie was closest to Bruce. A blade whispered through the black and Frenchie fell with a sound that was almost apologetic. Kimiko was already answering, silent and murderous, her knives finding the space where Noir had been an instant before. Butcher fired blindly, praying more than aiming. None of them, Bruce realized with sickening clarity, were the target. The assassin isolated him with the precision of a surgeon. He passed through the others the way a shadow passes through candlelight, and then he was between Bruce and the exit, and then he was closer and then closer still. Bruce backed into a corner and lifted his hands, not to fight, but to plead. Not with Noir, with the thing inside himself. Not here, he whispered, not with them so close. The blade found his shoulder, then his side. Noir was patient. He knew what he was hunting. He wanted the transformation. He wanted the sample. He carved his questions into Bruce's body with a craftsman's calm, and Bruce felt his pulse begin to rise beyond the ordinary math of fear. In the smoke and the ruin, the others saw only glimpses. They saw a scientist backed against a wall, bleeding, refusing to become a weapon. They saw a man choosing agony over the destruction that lived inside him. They saw a kind of courage that made no sense in a city built on manufactured strength. Kimiko froze, blade lowered. Butcher's mouth opened around a word he did not finish. In that moment, whatever suspicion they had held toward the green giant died quietly and was replaced by something more dangerous, understanding. Then Noir's blade found the artery. Bruce fell to one knee. His vision went white, then red, then the color of every promise he had ever broken. He apologized to no one and to everyone. He let go. The transformation this time was not a rage. It was a resurrection. Muscle rewrote itself in a language older than science. Bones lengthened, skin greened. The factory ceiling groaned upward as if intimidated. The blanket tore. The crates splintered. And in the corner where a bleeding scientist had knelt, a mountain of fury rose to its full and terrible height. Hulk looked down at Black Noir. Noir, to his credit, did not run. He did what he had been trained to do. He fought with the tactical brilliance that had made him legend among Vaught's darkest employees. He struck at joints, at eyes, at the soft places behind the ears. He used the walls, the shadows, the fallen beams. For a time, an impossible time, he survived. He drew blood. He drew roars. He forced the giant to falter. Every successful strike only strengthened Hulk further. The factory came apart around them. They crashed through the outer wall and into the industrial district beyond, and the battle spread like a fever through streets meant for machines. Warehouses folded, cranes toppled. A freight train screamed off its tracks and vanished into a cloud of green fury. The boys stumbled out into the ruin, dragging their wounded, and simply watched. There was nothing else to do. This was not their fight. It had never been. At last, bleeding from wounds he could not name, Black Noir made the calculation that had kept him alive through every impossible mission. He retreated. He melted into the smoke the way he had come, and even as he disappeared, some quiet part of him understood that he had not lost to a monster. He had lost to a man who refused to become one. Hulk stood alone in the ruined district, chest heaving, eyes searching for a threat that no longer existed. Slowly, painfully, the green began to recede. Neither Bruce nor Hulk noticed the small figures near the shattered warehouse wall. Gloved hands, dressed in Vought black, gathered flakes of dried green blood into sealed vials. One of the technicians smiled behind his mask. Somewhere far above, in a tower of glass and lies, scientists were about to smile back. They had found something priceless. For 3 days, the city held its breath. The news called it a gas leak. The government called it a training exercise. Vought called it nothing at all, which was in some ways the loudest statement of them all. Bruce spent those 3 days in the back of a windowless van, drifting between sleep and something worse than sleep, while the boys drove him from safe house to safe house across the wounded veins of the state. When he finally opened his eyes to a ceiling that did not shake, he found Butcher watching him with an expression that had learned, at last, how to be patient. They needed to understand, Butcher said quietly. All of it, not the surface. The bones beneath the bones. So they descended. Frenchie had spent years mapping the arteries of Vaught's hidden infrastructure, and he had a scholar's love for forbidden rooms. He led them beneath a defunct pharmaceutical plant in New Jersey, through a service tunnel that had been erased from every public map, into a sub-basement whose walls still hummed with the residue of experiments long since abandoned. Bruce walked at the back of the group, one hand pressed to the still tender wound along his ribs, and felt the air grow colder with each step. He had walked into laboratories all his life. He recognized this one the way a man recognizes the smell of his own childhood. The files were where Frenchie remembered them, old paper, older secrets. Bruce sat on an overturned filing cabinet and began to read. Mother's milk brought him a lamp. Kimiko brought him water. No one spoke because they had learned in those 3 days that when Bruce read, the world afterward tended to change shape. Compound V had never been a serum for heroes. That was the first sentence Bruce underlined with a trembling finger. The rest of the documents unspooled beneath his eyes like a confession too old to still be alive. Vaught's founders had not sought protectors. They had sought divinity. Every celebrity in a cape, every smiling face on a lunchbox, every square-jawed rescue caught on trembling phone footage had been a rehearsal, a step, a prototype. The company had spent generations trying to manufacture gods, and each generation had failed a little more gracefully than the last. Then he had arrived. Bruce set the folder down with the care of a man setting down a live grenade. He understood now why Vought had not killed him in the tunnels. He understood why Noir had wanted samples rather than a corpse. To them, he was not a threat. He was a confirmation. He was proof that the thing they had been chasing was possible, if only they could learn to build it themselves. Project Titan, the newest folder was called. It was not old. Some of its pages were still warm. They read together in silence. Vaught's scientists, armed at last with fragments of gamma cells recovered from a shattered industrial district, had begun to weave Compound V into the impossible. They were merging the manufactured with the miraculous. They were attempting, in laboratories scattered across 3 continents, to build a Hulk of their own. The photographs were included. Bruce looked at them for a long time and then looked away, because the images were not of soldiers or of heroes. They were of men and women who had been unmade, faces stretched too wide, bones grown where no bones should grow, skin the color of bruised fruit hanging from frames that had forgotten what species they belonged to. Every experiment ends catastrophically, one document noted, in the calm handwriting of a man who did not consider catastrophe a failure. Frenchie whispered a prayer under his breath. Mother's milk closed his eyes. Butcher, for once, said nothing at all. Bruce spoke into the quiet like a man testifying to himself. My whole life, he said, I have hated what I am. My whole life, I have prayed for a cure. And here, in this world, they are praying for the disease. He rose slowly. He gathered the folders. He placed them in a canvas bag with the reverence of a priest handling relics of some fallen faith. Then he walked back up the stairs into the wounded night air. And above them, somewhere far to the north, in a penthouse of glass and glittering ego, Homelander was already beginning to unravel. He watched the news obsessively now. He replayed the seized footage of his defeat, frame by frame in the private theater beneath his suite. He watched himself fall through a skyscraper. He watched his own face register something he could not yet name. He drank milk from a crystal glass and told the empty seats around him that it had been a tactical retreat, that he had allowed the giant to feel victory, that he had a plan. Each repetition thinned his voice a little further. Somewhere behind his eyes, the god of Vought was learning that gods, when unworshipped, become only monsters with better lighting. In the safe house that night, Bruce sat by a small window and watched the reflection of his own face in the black glass. He thought about Homelander. He thought about a man who had been built to be adored, who had never been given the option to be small. He thought about how power, when handed to a being who had never learned to fear it, became the loneliest kind of prison. He thought about his own decades of shaking hands, his own decades of whispered apologies to strangers, and he understood with a clarity that startled him that he pitied Homelander. The pity did not soften him. If anything, it hardened him. There was a moral weight to what they were becoming. He and this pale mirror of a man, and only one of them had learned to carry it. Deep in a laboratory beneath the desert, in a room that no map acknowledged, A technician stared at a sealed cylinder and slowly removed his goggles. Inside the cylinder, a liquid the color of storm clouds and green fire pulsed with a steady, patient rhythm. It did not thrash. It did not scream. It waited, the way something intelligent waits. Project Titan had, at last, produced a stable prototype. The technician pressed a trembling finger to the intercom and whispered a single sentence to the men who had built this world. "We have one," he said, "and it is beautiful." The first outbreak was in Denver, and no one who saw it survived to give it a name. A private research facility on the outskirts of the city vanished from the map in a single night. Satellite images captured a bloom of pale green light and then nothing but silence. By dawn, the surrounding suburbs had gone quiet in the wrong way, the way places go quiet when their throats have been cut. The first news helicopter to arrive filmed something in a schoolyard, a shape that had once been a man uncoiling into a size that no man should reach. The feed went dead. The pilot did not come home. Vought, for the first time in decades, could not confiscate the footage fast enough. The second outbreak was in Atlanta, the third in Chicago. By the end of the week, 7 cities in 3 countries had begun to burn from the inside. The gamma soups did not resemble anything the world had learned to fear. They were not the polished monsters of comic books. They were not the giant Bruce Banner had spent his life trying to control. They were failures wearing the shape of gods, mistakes given the strength to keep making themselves. Some were mute. Some screamed constantly in voices that layered over each other like broken choirs. Some remembered in flickers the men they had been, and those were the worst of all, because they begged for help even as their hands did unforgivable things. The public did not know they had been made. Vought made sure of that. The press releases spoke of a mysterious mutation, of a viral event, of unnamed foreign actors. The word superhero began in whispered conversations across kitchen tables to curdle. Children who had once worn Homelander pajamas asked their parents to take the posters down. Somewhere in that terrible week, faith itself began to die, and Vaught's stock dipped for the first time in a generation. The boys fought them. Of course they fought them. They fought them in subway tunnels and rooftops and parking structures, with weapons Frenchie had never intended to build and prayers mother's milk had never intended to say. They saved thousands. They lost dozens. They lost, in one terrible night on the Brooklyn Bridge, 3 of their oldest allies, men and women whose names Bruce had only just learned. He learned them again as he wrote them down. He learned them once more as he buried each name in a small notebook he kept against his chest. Bruce did not transform. He would not allow himself to. Every time the rage rose in him, he saw the schoolyard in Denver, the schoolyard he had never visited but could describe in perfect detail, and he swallowed the green back down until it tasted like guilt. Frenchie begged him to fight. Kimiko wrote him a note that simply said, "We need you." Butcher did not beg, because Butcher never begged. Butcher only sat across from him in the dim safe-house kitchen one night and said, quietly, "This is not your fault," made without meeting his eyes. Bruce believed him for exactly the length of one sentence. Then belief left him again. He isolated himself. He moved into a boarded-up storage room at the back of the safe house and locked the door from the inside. And for 2 long days he did not eat, did not speak, did not weep. He simply sat with his back against the wall and stared at his hands, and thought about the accident that had made him, and thought about the reactor that had torn a hole between worlds, and thought about the possibility that he was not merely a monster but a plague, a walking prophecy, a door through which every disaster of his home universe had been given permission to walk. Had he never crossed dimensions, he thought, none of this would have happened. Those children in Denver would have grown up. Those allies on the bridge would still be arguing about coffee. This world, corrupt as it was, would have limped along toward its own private ruin without needing his to accelerate it. The thought became a weight. The weight became a decision. Elsewhere, in a penthouse whose windows had begun to feel like the walls of a cell, Homelander received a visitor. The executive was elderly, wealthy, and afraid, which was a combination Homelander had learned to enjoy. The old man spoke of profits collapsing, of markets in free fall, of a world that no longer believed in the product Vought had spent a century selling. He spoke of the giant. He spoke of the outbreaks. He spoke, at last and most carefully, of a solution. "Capture him alive," the old man said. "Not kill him. Never kill him. He is a well. Wells are not to be poisoned. Wells are to be drawn from forever. Homelander stared out at the city he no longer owned. He thought of the green hands that had closed around his shoulders. He thought of the footage he still watched every night. He thought of a world in which he was not the strongest thing that had ever lived. He smiled the small, tight smile of a man who had finally found a use for his hatred. "Do it," he said. "Bring him to me. I want to watch them milk him." In the safe house, Bruce came out of the storage room at last. He looked at Butcher. He looked at Kimiko and Frenchie and Mother's Milk. He looked at each of them the way a man looks at his family before a long journey. "I am going to give myself to them," he said. Butcher was on his feet in an instant, cursing, refusing, arguing. Bruce let him finish. Then Bruce spoke, softly, in the voice of a man who had already crossed the hardest bridge of his life. "If they have me," he said, "they stop making more of them. If they have me, the outbreaks slow. If they have me, you get time. Time to end them. Time to end all of this. I cannot fight what I made, but I can be the cage that holds it." Butcher had no answer. There was none. At dawn, Bruce walked out of the safe house alone, his hands empty, his heart quiet, his eyes fixed on the black vans already waiting at the end of the street. They took him underground, and the ground swallowed him without a sound. The facility had no name on any document, only a designation of numbers and letters that meant nothing to anyone outside the innermost circle of Vought. It lay half a mile beneath the New Mexico desert, built during a war no one remembered, refurbished during wars no one had been told about. Its walls were lined with a lattice of copper and compound V, threaded through concrete like veins through meat. Its lights never dimmed. Its air smelled faintly of ozone and something older, something like the memory of blood. Bruce did not resist when they collared him. He did not resist when they stripped him. He did not resist when they laid him inside the cradle. A coffin of glass and steel wired with more sensors than a hospital, and closed the lid over his face. He looked up through the glass at the men who watched him, and he tried to remember whether any of them had children. Then the transformations began. They did not wait for his rage. They induced it. They ran currents through the cradle that made his muscles seize. They injected him with cocktails designed to trigger the change. They played recordings, endlessly, of the schoolyard in Denver, of the bridge in Brooklyn, of every dying voice their satellites had recorded during the outbreaks. They wanted the green. They wanted it on a schedule. They wanted it in vials. The first time Hulk erupted inside the cradle, the facility trembled all the way to its ceiling. The restraints held, barely. When it was over and Bruce came back to himself, curled and weeping in the ruin of his own body, the technicians were already smiling at their monitors. They had their sample. They stabilized his vitals. They gave him water and painkillers and a soft voice on a speaker that told him he was doing well. Then they did it again the next day, and the next, and the next. Time began to warp inside the cradle. Bruce lost the shape of hours. He lost the shape of days. He counted transformations at first, because counting was the only thread of self left to him, but eventually even the counting began to blur. He would wake with new bruises he did not remember earning. He would wake with the taste of iron in his mouth and no memory of what he had roared. Somewhere in the third week, or perhaps the fifth, he began to suspect that the man they were breaking in that room was not Bruce Banner anymore. He was something thinner, something quieter, something almost ready to agree with them. The world above did not know he was there. It only knew that the outbreaks had slowed and that Homelander had begun appearing on every screen, in every broadcast, at every hour of the day, with a voice that had begun to acquire the calm certainty of a father speaking to a frightened child. He spoke of order. He spoke of protection. He spoke of the necessary sacrifices humanity would have to make if it wished to survive the age of monsters. The public, exhausted and grieving, began to nod along. New laws were passed with terrifying speed. New checkpoints appeared in cities. New cameras. New silences. The boys tried. They tried until their bones ached from trying. Without Hulk, without Bruce, they were only men and women in a war designed for gods. They rescued who they could. They buried who they must. Butcher stopped drinking, then started again, then stopped again, and the pattern of his hands on a glass began to look like the pattern of a prayer no one had taught him. Beneath the desert, in the cradle, Bruce began to agree. He began to agree quietly, the way a man agrees to sleep after a long illness. He began to think that the technicians were right. The world had been safer, hadn't it, before he arrived? The world had been corrupt but stable. He had brought the fracture. He had brought the plague. Perhaps the kindest thing he could do was allow himself to be used. Perhaps this cradle was not a prison but a penance. Perhaps he had at last found the cage his younger self had always dreamed of. The transformation that morning was slower to come. The technicians frowned. The current was raised. The recordings were played louder. Still the green would not rise. One of them muttered that the subject was breaking, which he said with satisfaction rather than concern. Break the man, they had been taught, and the monster becomes easier to schedule. Inside the cradle, Bruce closed his eyes. He did not reach, this time, for the anger. He did not brace against the other. Instead, in the deep quiet of a soul that had run out of places to hide, he turned toward the presence he had spent his entire life running from. He looked at it. He truly looked at it for the first time. "I am sorry," he said in the private country of his own mind. The green stilled. "I have hated you," he said. "I have called you a curse. I have blamed you for every ruin. I have never once thanked you for the times you carried me when I could not carry myself. I have never once considered that you were not my enemy. You were my grief given shape. You were the part of me the world would not let me be, and I abandoned you over and over because I was ashamed." The green listened. "I am not ashamed anymore," he said. "I am not ashamed of you." Something inside him, something older than the accident, older than the reactor, older perhaps than his own name, breathed out at last. The cradle registered a spike its instruments could not classify. The technicians looked up. One of them opened his mouth to shout a warning. The cradle came apart the way a paper lantern comes apart in a hurricane. He rose from the wreckage not as a rage, not as a hunger. He rose as a whole thing at last, green and quiet and enormous. And his eyes, when they opened, were both the eyes of the monster and the eyes of the man. Bruce inside Hulk, Hulk inside Bruce. Two syllables of a single name at last spoken together. The facility above him felt it before its instruments could describe it. Half a mile of desert lifted briefly and settled again with a groan that could be heard across 3 states. Somewhere far above, in a tower of glass, a smiling god stopped smiling. The world had just changed hands. New York learned that morning what it sounded like when a god arrived on foot. He came out of the desert first, and then out of the west, and then out of a long, unbroken stride across the wounded interior of the country. He did not fly. He did not need to. Every mile of him was a statement. Every step of him was a sentence in a language older than Vought, older than empire, older than the small, proud stories humans told themselves about strength. When he reached the outskirts of the city at dusk, the sky above him was already streaked with the pale green of a storm that had chosen a name. The city, for its part, was already at war with itself. Gamma mutants had risen again in the burrows, drawn by some instinct none of the surviving scientists could explain, converging on Manhattan the way iron shavings converge on a magnet. Vought security forces had deployed in numbers not seen since the founding of the company, and their armored columns choked every bridge and tunnel. Rogue soups, half of them loyal to Homelander, half of them terrified of him, tore across the skyline in flashes of light and blood. Somewhere in the middle of it all, the boys moved with the exhausted precision of people who had run out of hope, but not yet out of will. Butcher led them through the ruins of Midtown with a rifle in one hand and a photograph in the other. And no one asked whose face was in the photograph, because they all already knew. Above them, in the last unbroken tower of Vought, Homelander watched the horizon and waited. He had chosen his ground. He had chosen his lights. He had even chosen his angle, because some old, small, ridiculous part of him could not stop thinking about the cameras. He wore his cape like a costume and his face like a mask, and beneath both, something had begun to crack in a way that could not be repaired. He had spent his life being the most powerful thing in every room. He was about to find out what happened to men like him when a room finally refused to close around them. Hulk arrived at the edge of Manhattan at nightfall, and every mutant in the city turned its head at once. He did not roar. He did not charge. He walked into the burning avenues with the calm of a man walking into his own home to put out a fire in the kitchen. When the first mutant lanced at him, he caught it, held it, and set it down. When it lunged again, he set it down harder. He did not kill. He did not hate. He moved through the outbreaks with the tenderness of a father breaking up a fight among frightened children. And where his hands passed, the chaos began, block by block, to settle. The boys reached him near the ruins of Grand Central. Butcher stopped in the middle of the street and lowered his rifle, because there was nothing in the world at that moment more useless than a rifle. Bruce, inside the giant, met his eyes. He did not need to speak. Butcher understood. Butcher nodded once, in the way of men saying goodbye without saying goodbye, and the giant walked on toward the tower where the last false god waited. Homelander met him in the air above the plaza. The clash of them broke windows for 20 blocks in every direction. Homelander came down like a red comet, and Hulk met him with an upthrown arm that turned the comet into a stumble. They fell together into the concrete of the plaza, and the plaza folded around them. Homelander rose first, screaming, unleashing every ounce of his heat vision in twin red rivers that cut across the giant's chest and shoulders. The green skin blistered. The green did not fall. "You were supposed to be a monster," Homelander shouted, and the microphones of 100 news drones caught the tremor in his voice for the first time in his life. "You were supposed to be like me." Hulk answered by picking him up and setting him down again, and the ground where he set him became a crater. The fight moved through the city the way weather moves. It broke against the base of the tower. It broke against the ruins of the bridge. It broke, at last, against the wall of a small park where a fountain still ran absurdly in the middle of the ruin. Homelander was faster. Hulk was patient. Homelander was cruel. Hulk was, in a word that would not have made sense to anyone in this universe a year earlier, kind. He did not kill. He did not maim. Every blow he struck was calibrated to the smallest possible violence that would end the exchange. He was teaching, in the only language Homelander had ever spoken, a lesson that Homelander had spent his life refusing to learn. Power did not grant the right to rule. Restraint did. The end came quietly, as endings often do. Homelander threw a final punch. Hulk caught the fist in one enormous hand, held it, and slowly forced it down. He looked into the eyes of the man who had been sold to the world as its greatest hero, and he saw at last the frightened child inside. He saw the loneliness. He saw the years of applause that had never once been love. He saw the small, ridiculous emptiness that all the milk in the world had never been able to fill. He did not kill him. He set him down gently in the grass beside the fountain. He let the cameras see it. He let the world see it. Then he turned his back on the strongest manufactured being of a generation and walked away. And Homelander lay in the wet grass with his cape torn and his lips moving around words no one would ever record, and every worshiper he had ever had watched. In real time, the moment his religion ended. Above the city, the sky began to scream. The gamma reactor at the heart of Project Titan, deep beneath the harbor, had begun its final collapse. Vaught's last desperate attempt to weaponize what they could not understand was about to erase half the eastern seaboard. Alarms bloomed across every network. Evacuations began that could not possibly complete in time. Hulk turned toward the harbor. He did not hesitate. He did not weep. He walked into the water with the same steady stride he had used to enter the city. And when he reached the collapsing reactor, he wrapped his enormous arms around it, and he held. He held while the energy tore at him. He held while the sky above him bloomed green. He held while a universe that was never his made room, at the last moment, for the shape of his sacrifice. The world went white. When it could see again, the harbor was empty. Months passed, the way months do after the end of the world. Vought did not fall in a single night. Empires rarely do. It fell in slow humiliations, in leaked documents, in whistleblowers whose voices could no longer be silenced now that the machinery of silence had been broken. It fell in courtrooms and in stock reports, in resignations delivered by trembling hands, in press releases that fooled no one. It fell in the small, terrible discovery, made in 100 kitchens across 100 cities, that the heroes people had loved had never once loved them back. The public did not riot. The public did something worse. It went quiet. It stopped buying. It stopped watching. It stopped, at last, believing. The tower came down on a Tuesday in the ordinary sunlight of an ordinary afternoon, and the crowd that gathered to watch it fall was not celebrating. They were mourning something in themselves that had believed, for too long, in a lie. The boys survived. Not all of them, not most of them, but enough. Butcher walked with a limp now, and Mother's milk had lost the hearing in one ear. And Frenchie had stopped smoking, which surprised him more than it surprised anyone else. Kimiko had started to speak again, quietly, in a voice that sounded like snow. They met on Sunday evenings in the back room of a bar that had once belonged to a man they had all disliked. And they talked sometimes about the old missions, and sometimes about nothing, and sometimes about a green giant who had walked into a harbor and never walked out. They did not speak of Bruce often. When they did, it was with the careful grammar people use for the dead who might not be dead. Butcher said once, into his glass, that he did not think the harbor had taken him. He did not explain what he meant. No one asked him to. Homelander lived. That was the cruelest joke of all, and everyone who had ever hated him agreed it was also the fairest. He lived alone in a house whose address no journalist would print, in a country whose name did not matter. His face had been broadcast to every screen on Earth in the moments after his defeat. The footage of him lying in the grass, weeping without knowing he was weeping, had been played and replayed until the world had memorized every twitch of his mouth. Some people had laughed. Most had not. The strangest reaction had been pity, and pity was the one thing his life had been designed to make impossible. He could not be worshipped now. He could not be feared. He could only be watched, from a distance, by neighbors who nodded politely and did not invite him inside. He tried at first to command adoration again. He appeared on a small talk show in a small country and smiled his old smile at the small audience. They clapped politely. They did not scream. They did not cry. They did not lift their children onto their shoulders. When he flew away that night, he flew low, because the sky above the clouds had begun, in some way he could not explain, to frighten him. Around the world, the story of the Green Titan grew the way stories grow when the people who lived them stopped trying to tell them. Children in Lagos drew him in chalk on the sides of buildings. Fishermen in the Aegean carved his shape into driftwood. A monk in Kyoto wrote a poem that ended with the line, "The one who did not need to be loved to love us." The poem was translated into 40 languages within a year. None of the translations agreed on the last word. He became, without meaning to, the first hero of the new century, not because he had been the strongest, not because he had won, because he had chosen, at the end, to be gentle in a world that had forgotten what gentleness looked like coming out of something so large. In the Adirondacks, in a stretch of forest that no road reached and no map named, a park ranger reported an anomaly on her equipment. A faint trace of gamma radiation, no larger than a heartbeat, pulsing at the edge of a clearing where she had never seen anyone walk. She reported it once. She did not report it again. She was not sure why. She only knew that when she had approached the clearing, the air there had felt warm and safe and old, like the memory of a hand on her shoulder when she had been a very small girl and afraid of the dark. She went home. She kept the coordinates in her notebook. She never showed them to anyone. In a private vault beneath the desert, in a room whose existence had been erased from 3 different sets of records, a single sealed cylinder still glowed faintly green. It had survived the collapse of Project Titan by the accident of being forgotten. It waited, patient as such things wait, for a hand that would eventually come. The hand would not come soon. The hand might not come for a generation. But it would come. Things like that always did. Bruce Banner, wherever he was, would not know about it for a long time. The boys did not know about it either. They only knew that the world felt different now. Cleaner in some places, dirtier in others, but different. People argued about heroism again, the way they had once argued about religion. Some said heroism was gone forever. Some said it had only just begun. Some said, quietly, in the back rooms of bars that had once belonged to men they had disliked, that heroism had never been a person at all. It had been a choice. And the giant had shown them, at last, what the choice looked like. Butcher would drink to that. When he drank, Kimiko would smile when she smiled. And somewhere in a clearing in the Adirondacks, a small warm patch of grass grew a shade greener than the grass around it. and did not fade with the seasons, and did not answer when the wind asked its name. There are stories the world tells because it needs them to be true, and there are stories the world tells because it is afraid they might be. The tale of the Green Titan became both. In the years that followed, historians would argue about him. Poets would argue about him more usefully. Children would not argue about him at all, because children understood him best. They understood that he had been very strong and very sad, that he had come from somewhere far away, and that he had chosen, at the end, to hold a dying star in his arms so that strangers could keep living. They drew him with crayons. They named their toys after him. They asked their parents at bedtime whether he had been real. Their parents, who had grown up in a world of manufactured gods, learned to answer that question carefully. Yes, they said, he was real. He is still real, in the way real things are still real when they are no longer visible. The boys grew older. They did not grow soft. Corruption, they had learned, was a weed that returned every spring, and the work of pulling it up was never finished, but they worked differently now. They worked with a memory sitting quietly in the corner of every room they entered, a memory shaped like a man who had refused, at the last moment, to become his own worst nightmare. When Butcher was tempted, as he often was, to cross a line he had spent his life pretending not to cross, he would sometimes stop with his hand halfway to the trigger. He would think of a green figure walking into a harbor. He would take a breath. He would find, more often than he would ever admit, another way. The world did not always notice these small refusals. The world did not need to. He noticed them, and that was enough. Homelander lived on for many years in the strange half-life of the deposed. He did not repent. Men like him rarely did, but he grew quieter over time and less certain, and toward the end of his long, lonely life he was seen, sometimes, sitting on the porch of a small house at dusk, watching the sky the way a child watches the sky. What he was looking for, no one ever asked him. What he was afraid of finding, no one ever knew. He died, eventually, without cameras. It was the only kindness the world had ever refused to sell him, and in the end it was the only kindness he had ever needed. The last sealed vial in the last forgotten vault, in the last erased room beneath the desert, waited patiently for its century. It would be found in time. It would be argued over. It would be studied by men and women who had not yet been born. And it would raise, one day, a question that the world would have to answer all over again. Whether the answer would be worthy of the giant who had inspired it, no one could yet say. That was the thing about legacies. They were promises the future made to the past, and the future did not always keep its word. Yet in the meantime, the story spread. It spread the way rivers spread, finding the low places in every culture, filling the shapes that were ready to hold it. In cities that had never known him, murals of a green figure appeared on the sides of buildings, painted overnight by artists who could not always explain why they had painted him. In classrooms, teachers began to use his name as a shorthand for a certain kind of courage, not the loud kind, not the marketable kind, the kind that carried a weight it had not asked for and set it down, gently, where it needed to be set down. Somewhere in the middle of the century, a small girl in a small town wrote an essay about him for a school assignment. Her teacher wept while grading it and did not know why. The essay ended with the sentence, "He was strong enough to be kind." The teacher pinned it to the wall and left it there for many years. And in the vast dark between worlds, in the quiet architecture that no telescope had ever mapped, the small fractures Bruce Banner had left in reality continued to ripple outward, patient as tides. They did not close. They did not widen. They simply were, the way scars simply are, remembering. Somewhere in that dark, other stories were beginning. Somewhere in that dark, other legends were preparing to cross a boundary they had not known existed. A knight with a burning sword, a soldier with a broken helmet, a witch with a name older than her voice, a god who had grown tired of being worshipped. Each of them, in their own universe, felt the faint tug of a door that had been left open, and each of them, in their own time, would decide whether to walk through. The Green Titan had shown them the way, not with power, with the choice not to use it. The narrator at the end of all things is only a voice, and voices are only shapes the silence makes on its way to becoming something else. So let this voice leave you with a single thought, spoken softly, the way important things should always be spoken. If one hero could change an entire universe by refusing to become its monster, imagine what could happen if another legend crossed the same boundary. Imagine what could happen if the door, once opened, was never quite closed again. Imagine what could happen if, somewhere in the dark between worlds, someone was already listening. Somewhere, someone is.